A comedian once said, "You can say you don't believe in God, but when the ground starts shaking, everyone looks up." A tremor may last only for a few seconds, but it can raise questions that linger much longer. This is the Divide Podcast, and today we're talking fault lines and asking, where does faith draw the line? Welcome back to The Divide. I am excited to have you here with me, and I'm looking forward to an interesting conversation. As I begin this particular podcast, it's July the 2nd. So, in just 2 days, the United States will be celebrating its 250th anniversary. What an exciting time for our country. And I will be unpacking that a little bit more in the coming weeks. This idea of the United States in Bible prophecy. Some of you enjoyed the last presentation on the Sabbath and how that will play into things in the coming days and weeks and months, but specifically as we get toward the end times. But July 4 is a exciting time. It's the hot dogs and barbecues and 4th of July fireworks and all those types of things. I was listening to the radio as I was driving into work this morning, and they were talking about this fellow that has the record for like 75 hot dogs in a row, and they were talking about who had a better chance of getting the next record, whether it would be more hot dogs eaten or if Shohei Ohtani, the baseball player, would have a better chance at being the National League Player of the Year or something like that. And the commentator I was listening to, he's like, I have a better chance of being a great pitcher than I do eating all those hot dogs. It's not an easy thing to do to eat all those hot dogs. But I hope that whatever your plans are for the weekend, that you'll have a great and wonderful 4th of July. Or if you're listening to this after the 4th is over, I hope that you enjoyed it. I want to talk a little bit about the earth shaking. I don't think that most of us think about fault lines until something breaks, because the fact of the matter is that life feels solid maybe until it doesn't. Now, I live here in Columbia, Maryland, and I did not expect that I would experience earthquakes here in this part of the country. I was in the lower part of the building, right below the sanctuary. In fact, I was right underneath where the grand piano from the sanctuary sits. And this particular afternoon, when I was here with a number of other members, we were standing around, and all of a sudden there was just this big boom, and the building shook, and I literally looked up thinking that piano was coming through the floor, and didn't know what had happened, didn't know what was going on in that exact moment. The people that I was with, we all just kind of ran upstairs to see if anything had fallen upstairs, and then we went outside, and lo and behold, everybody had evacuated the building or was in the process of evacuating the building. We found out about an hour later or so that this was an earthquake that had hit, and it was registering about 2.4 on the Richter scale. So it wasn't a big shaking. It was more of just a big boom that happened within a matter of seconds, and it was first time I've ever experienced anything like that. And I've lived on the West Coast. We lived up in greater Seattle area, and I've never experienced any earthquakes or tremors there in the entire 4 years that we lived there. But something has been going on. In fact, over the last couple of weeks, we've seen a string of significant earthquakes making the news. In fact, in the span of about 24 hours, there were a bunch of earthquakes that hit all around the Pacific Ocean, and many of them were significant earthquakes. There was also making news on June June 24, 25, right in that area. There was two major earthquakes that affected northwestern and central Venezuela. The first earthquake measured 7.2, and then 35 seconds later, another one, 7.5, hit. These two earthquakes caused widespread damage across the country. More than almost 2,300 people have been killed. 11,000 people confirmed missing, and they're expecting 100,000 people potentially to be impacted, maybe even dying. And if you're watching on YouTube, you can see the picture on the screen that we have here. It's the Ring of Fire, and this is where all of the earthquakes that happened in that same 24 hours as Venezuela. There was 5.6 category magnitude earthquake in California. There were 2 in Japan. There were 2 in the Philippines. There was 1 in Papua New Guinea, and all of this was happening all within a 24-hour period of time. And some of them are devastating, some of them smaller, but still widely felt. And the question that follows is, hey, is there something unusual going on? Why did all these earthquakes happen at the same time? And I'm not on social media that often. In fact, since I've launched this podcast, I've been on a little bit more than usual, a little more than more often checking things out, trying to promote and so forth. But I also noticed that there are people that are posting, "Oh, end times. This is significant. All of these earthquakes is having an impact." And so I began to wonder: is there something unusual, or are we just noticing more of what's always been there? Because if we're honest, there's usually 2 extremes of categories. The one extreme says, oh, every earthquake is a countdown clock, every tremor is a prophecy fulfillment, and the headlines are the proof of it. And then there's the other extreme that says, well, none of this really matters. It's just chance. It's natural. It's nature. It happens. So before I got too far into it, I thought, well, what constitutes a major earthquake? As I've been looking at the news and in preparing for this, the San Andreas Fault, they say right now, is under more stress than they've ever recorded in 1,000 years. And that's interesting to me because I didn't know that they were recording the San Andreas Fault 1,000 years ago, but apparently they've got some history for that. And you're familiar with the term Richter scale, and we throw these numbers around. And for those that are watching on YouTube, you can see I've put the magnitude scale up there, courtesy of the United States Geological Survey. They produced this scale for us. You hear 1.4, you have 5.0, or 7.3 on the Richter scale. And when scientists talk about major earthquakes, they're usually talking about anything that's over 7.0 and above, because at that level, damage is pretty widespread depending on the depth and the location. And a magnitude 8 and above, they're rare. They happen about once a year around the globe, and it grabs global attention. They're extremely powerful. Now, for perspective and context, a 3.0 earthquake is about 100,000 times smaller in ground motion and releases about 1 million times less energy than an 8.0 earthquake. So an 8.0 is going to release significant energy through the earth. The size of an earthquake increases by a factor of 10 for each whole number increase in magnitude, and energy releases by a factor of 32 times per whole number increase. So that just gives you an idea that an 8 is significantly more powerful than a 7. And you see sometimes videos of earthquake damage, and you see all these things that are going on around the world. In fact, I was able to license this video. It shows that the building had fallen on cars and made quite the impact. But for this conversation, over the past century, the number of major earthquakes feels like it's happening more, but when you actually look at the numbers, there's not a clear trend upward. In fact, on average, the Earth sees about 15 magnitude 7 earthquakes per year, and as I mentioned a moment ago, only one of 8 magnitude or higher. Some years are busier, it's true. Some years are also quieter, and so when you look at the long-term pattern, it doesn't really show steady increase. But what has changed is not the Earth, it's us. Because in this day and age of technology and social media and having our smart devices in our pocket, we see more, we hear more, we know more, and we know it faster than ever. 100 years ago, an earthquake across the ocean might never make your newspaper, but today it's on your phone before lunch, sometimes before you've had your morning coffee, which, depending on the morning, might actually feel like the real disaster. Now, earthquakes themselves aren't new, not even close. In fact, history has been marked by them. I did just a little bit of research and I discovered that in 1556, China had one of the deadliest recorded earthquakes in history. They estimate that over 100,000 people died in that earthquake. 1755, there was an earthquake in Lisbon that was so devastating, it shook European philosophy and theology itself. In fact, when I was a kid growing up in church school, I remember that we studied the 1755 Lisbon earthquake as one of the great earthquakes that began to get people thinking about the soon return of Jesus. In fact, the Great Advent Awakening that began in the the early 1800s was born out of, in part, this massive shaking in Lisbon, because even here in the United States, we heard about it. 1906, San Francisco, the city was reshaped. 1960, the largest recorded earthquake ever in Chile, recorded at 9.5 on the Richter scale. You'll remember the Indian Ocean earthquake in 2004, right around Christmas time, the tsunami that just totally devastated the coastal area and rewrote how the coast looked, actually. There was also the earthquake in Haiti, and in 2011, another tsunami. You'll remember that after the earthquake in Japan. Different places, same reality. When the ground moves, everything on top of it shakes and it reveals some things. And that's where I started thinking and started wondering, because maybe Jesus wasn't talking so much about earthquakes when he told the disciples that earthquakes would be a thing just before he came. Maybe he's using earthquakes to point us to something deeper. In Matthew chapter 24, the disciples asked Jesus about the end of the age. And specifically, the disciples are asking about the end of Jerusalem. Because if you'll remember, Jesus had just told them at the end of chapter 23 that not one stone would be left upon another and that they were all going to be thrown down. In fact, if you're watching on YouTube, you can see the rocks that are thrown down. Those stones were thrown down in 70 AD when Titus came in and attacked Jerusalem. And Jesus was talking about the temple in Jerusalem. He was talking about the pride of the nation. And when he was talking about that, he was talking about the chief landmark, the center of religion. And so Jesus says that the temple is going to be destroyed. Now, just imagine the disciples move across to the Mount of Olives. And if you're watching YouTube, the picture that I'm showing there, this picture is a picture that I took. It was kind of a hazy day from the top of the Mount of Olives, looking across the Kidron Valley into the Temple Mount. In this picture, you can see it a little more clearly. So just imagine that the disciples are standing somewhere around here, and they're looking across the Kidron Valley into the Temple Mount, around where the Eastern Gate is. And the disciples are looking, and they've got the words of Jesus ringing in their ears that the temple is about to be destroyed. This must be the end of the world. And so they say to Jesus, when are these things going to be? Now understand, they're connecting the temple being destroyed with Jesus' second coming. I mean, what else could it be? If the temple's getting destroyed, then this must be it. And when Jesus answers, many Bible experts now agree that Jesus gives a both and answer, a now and not yet, if you will. In other words, Jesus gives signs for physical destruction of Jerusalem and the tearing down of the temple. And he gives the same signs for what will be happening just before he returns at the time of the end. And in that list, in verse 7, Matthew chapter 24 and verse 7, he says, "For nation will rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom, and there will be famines and pestilences and earthquakes in various places." Now, look at the list: wars, famines, and earthquakes. It's interesting that there was a series of earthquakes between 31 AD and 70 AD. So Jesus is talking to the disciples about events that will happen in their lifetime. The worst of those earthquakes was likely in Crete around 46 or 47 AD. There was another earthquake recorded in 51 in Rome, and Campania in 63. The historian Tacitus also speaks particularly of several hurricanes and storms that year, specifically around 65 AD. Not just threw that in because I think it's interesting. Now, it's Jesus's words would be in the minds of his disciples as they're preaching. But then don't forget what Jesus says next in verse 8. He says, "And these are the beginning of sorrows," or as the English Standard Version says, that these are the beginning of earth pains. The beginning. Now, birth pains, what's interesting is they don't tell you the exact moment everything's going to begin or end. They tell you that something hasn't started, or something that has started is not about to stay hidden. Something's about to come into the world. And so when Jesus gives us these warnings, he's not inviting panic. He's pointing to a pressure point. He's saying that something even more surprising is about to happen, and he wants to make sure that we're not alarmed, just that we're alert. And so he's inviting us to be aware, to be paying attention, because alarm is the easiest reaction in the world right now. And in fact, I think there's a lot of alarm going on around the world. And we see things. We see gas prices going up. We see war, Iran. We have concerns about what's going on in China and all these different things. But for our purposes and for the purposes of the show today, this is where I think the fault line metaphor actually begins to matter. Because earthquakes don't just reveal geological fault lines, they reveal something else. And how we interpret them begins to matter. Because some people see shaking and they immediately jump to fear, and some people immediately dismiss it. Both are reactions that I think can miss something. Because what's really being exposed isn't just under the earth. It's about us. It's about our assumptions, our fears, and our beliefs about whether or not the world has meaning or direction. What does pressure actually reveal? Well, here are some things that I've noticed in life. Pressure doesn't create who we are, it reveals who we are. And pressure will do the same for faith, for doubt, for panic, for what we trust. And so earthquakes are just kind of an example here of something bigger that's going on that Jesus is talking about. And in this specific instance, they interrupt the illusion that things are stable when maybe they just really aren't. I mean, as I'm thinking about it, everything was going well when I was standing there in the bottom level of our church having a conversation with some of my leadership and members, and all of a sudden that boom hits. All of a sudden, there was a lot of questions. And, thinking about earthquakes, I don't think anyone wakes up thinking, today's a good day for tectonic instability. There's no weather app that tells us it's coming. There's no notification. There's no gentle alert necessarily. Just boom, there it was. And suddenly, I was rethinking my entire life at that moment. I'm not consciously going, oh, I'm going to die. That never entered my mind. But I did look up, and I did wonder if something was about to come through the roof. Which is probably why after every earthquake, there's somebody saying, oh, this has got to be the end. And somebody else is going, you need to relax. And both of them are usually just a little too confident. So, I just wonder, where does that leave us? Because honestly, both extremes are tempting. It's easy to be obsessed with signs. It's easy to become indifferent to them. But Jesus seems to be pulling into something else, a little more steady, a little more careful, and he's inviting us to pay attention, not to panic, to stay awake, maybe not to obsess, but definitely to live ready. That's not a prediction strategy. This is more of a posture for life, a way of being faithful, a way of being alert, a way of paying attention, but not getting carried away, because when we get carried away, we run the risk of turning other people off. Because, remember the story of the little boy who cried wolf over and over and over again. Pretty soon people just say, we're not going to listen to them anymore because they don't know what they're talking about. So maybe the better question for people of faith is not, is this the end? Maybe a better question for us would be to ask, what does this reveal? What does this reveal about the time that we're living in? What does this reveal about us? What does it reveal about our faith, the current state of our faith? Because earthquakes reveal fault lines, but life reveals faith lines, where we've actually been standing, what we've actually been trusting, and what holds when the ground starts to shake. And all of these things really begin to matter. When the earth shakes, when life shakes. Why am I sharing this with you? Well, part of the reason is because it was on this day. In fact, as I'm recording this, it's about 3 o'clock in the afternoon on July the 2nd. It was 1 year ago today. In fact, it was 1 year ago in a couple of hours. I got a text message from my dad telling me to pray that my mom was not responding. And to make a long story short, my mom passed away on this date exactly 1 year ago. I struggled then, struggling now. Because it was unforeseen, it was unexpected. I had just moved from that part of the country to the part of the country I'm living now. I'd only been living here for a matter of weeks, in fact. In fact, just to make this even more real, 3 weeks before my mom died, her mom had passed away, my grandmother. And I was close to my grandparents as a kid growing up, so that was hard. So on the day that I drove out of town, leaving Northwest Arkansas to move here to Maryland, I had stopped. The very last thing I did before I left the state was I stopped at the nursing home where my grandmother was, and I'd given her a hug and a kiss and told her that I would see her next time, and next time will be when the Lord returns. And as I left, I really thought I'd have to make a turn around and come back before I'd actually made it to Maryland. But we got to Maryland, and for 3 weeks we were getting settled and transitioning to our new life here, and my grandmother passes away, and then 3 weeks later I'm making another trip back to Arkansas because my mom had passed away. I want to tell you, for me, that felt like an earthquake. The earth shook, not physically, it was more of an earthquake that happened within life and faith. And that's why I was talking about this, because when these events happen, they reveal more about us. And in the world, there are going to be literal earthquakes, but there are also going to be life tragedies that are going to shake us to the very core. Seismologists spend their lives trying to understand fault lines, where they are, how much pressure they're carrying, and what happens when they finally slip. And that's an important work for them. And maybe there's another kind of line paying attention to, and those are the faith lines. Because every crisis reveals them, every disappointment, every diagnosis. We're going to have economic downturns. There's going to be earthquakes. Jesus also talked about wars and rumors of wars. We hear about war in Iran. We hear about war between Ukraine and Russia. We hear about disturbances around the world. We hear about the earthquakes. We hear about the diseases. We're only 6 years removed from the pandemic. But these moments aren't what create belief. They're what reveal belief. They reveal what we've been standing on all along. So maybe the earthquakes that have just happened in the past couple of weeks aren't just exposing the fault lines beneath the earth. Maybe it's also about exposing the faith lines within us. I want to thank you for joining me again today on the Divide podcast. I want to let you know about some things that are coming. And first of all, give you the opportunity, if you haven't done already, to like and subscribe and get notified every time we upload a new video or podcast. Right now, we're on YouTube at Divide Podcast, and you can download each episode. You've already probably found us from the Podbean. And in coming days and weeks, we'll be on Apple Podcasts and Spotify, and we're getting all those things lined up. I'm looking forward to being able to launch our new website as well. But if you want to email me, you can email me at the Divide Podcast at BenOrian. That's BenOrian.com. I invite you to do that. If you want to just have a little bit of laugh, a little bit of the light side, catch up with highlights from the show, you can follow me on my TikTok. You can get the YouTube as well. I'm on Facebook at Pastor Ben Orian. Again, my last name is Orian for those that are following along. I invite you to do that. And of course, like and share and send the word out. Help me get the word out about what we're doing. I'm looking forward to having some guests on the show as well in the coming weeks as we talk about different things. Again, as we're finishing up this show, the world will always have opinions. They'll always have opinions about where fault lines are. They'll debate the science. They'll debate the politics. They'll debate the predictions. But here on The Divide, we're asking a different question. Not where the fault lines are, but we're asking, where does faith draw the line? I'm Pastor Ben Orian. Have a great week.